routine afternoon flight just took off from Tamanrasset Airport in Algeria, with 103 people on board. But within 2 minutes, something so terrifying happened that only one man came out alive. Just before the incident, a pilot reported from the cockpit, "We have a small problem." But that small problem took only 8 seconds to become the deadliest aviation disaster on Algerian soil. So what went wrong? Who was responsible for this? This is the devastating story of Air Algérie Flight 6289, the flight that was doomed even before it left the runway. 6th of March 2003. The story started in Tamanrasset, Algeria. If you've never heard of this place, there's a good reason. It sits right in the geographical center of the Sahara Desert, making it one of the most remote cities on Earth. But why is there a city in the middle of a desert? Simply as a stopover on the Trans-Saharan Highway, which is one of the only paved roads crossing the desert. The airport sits right alongside that highway. And on that scorching afternoon, Air Algérie Flight 6289 was preparing for departure. The plane was packed with 97 passengers and 6 crew members. Most of them were Algerian, heading north to the capital, Algiers. Among the passengers was a 28-year-old soldier, Youssef Jalali, in seat number 103. He was heading back to his barracks after leave. He's assigned to the last row, and he had no idea that the seat assignment would do a miracle in his life. But was there anything special in the last row of this Boeing 737-200? Frankly, no. It was the earliest generation of the world's most common airliner. Air Algérie's fleet was old, outdated, and questionable. Algeria had just emerged from 11 years of civil war, terrorist attacks, and hijackings. The airline didn't have enough money for modern planes, and even worse, it would take another decade before they could afford upgrades. So for now, they were flying these aging aircraft powered by cigar-shaped Pratt & Whitney JT-8D engines. And the reality was, those engines were very much tired. The left engine had accumulated over 20,000 flight cycles. But it had not been overhauled since 1999. Inside that engine, in a component called the Stage 1 nozzle guide vane, tiny cracks were spreading, which came from thermal damage, aging, and metal fatigue. The guide vane let the heated air pass from the combustion chamber into the high-pressure turbine. The cracks were invisible, but no inspection had caught them. As a result, they were about to reach the breaking point. But the real problem still wasn't the engine. It was something else sitting right inside the cockpit. Captain Boualem Benawicha takes the left seat. He's been flying since 1979, with over 10,000 total hours. About 1,000 on the 737 itself. He was experienced. But there's something odd. He had also been flying the Boeing 767 at the same time, despite international rules banning pilots from flying 2 different types of aircraft without a common type rating. So this was a red flag, and a big one. His first officer was Fatima Yousfi. She made history in the late 90s as the first woman ever to fly for an Algerian airline. By 2003, she had 5,200 hours total, including 1,300 on the 737. Actually, she's been flying this aircraft 6 months longer than Benawicha has. That day, Captain Benawicha was late, and First Officer Yousfi sat alone on the flight deck, running through pre-departure calculations by herself. She was about to start the pre-flight briefing when Benawicha finally arrived, bringing a flight attendant with him. Finally, they started the engines, and instead of focusing on the briefing, the captain kept talking to the flight attendant. This violated the cockpit rule, which prohibited non-essential conversation between engine start and 10,000 feet. The pre-flight briefing fizzled out. They never got to the important parts or discussed emergency procedures. Even worse, they never reviewed what to do if an engine fails after takeoff, as if they weren't in the mood to fly that day. Otherwise, the engine failure on the takeoff procedure is something every pilot should have memorized cold, which goes like this. Reduce the nose angle, maintain V2 speed, raise landing gear, increase thrust on the good engine, and use rudder to counter the yaw or the side-to-side movement of the nose. These steps need to happen from the muscle memory within seconds. The whole point of the pre-flight briefing is to train your brain, to make sure you react correctly when disaster strikes. But they simply skipped it, and in a few minutes, karma for that negligence would hit them harder. 3:08 in the afternoon. The aircraft was almost at maximum takeoff weight. The airfield elevation was over 1,300 meters. The temperature was high. And all of these factors meant one thing: they needed maximum performance to get airborne. Because hot air is less dense and high altitude means thinner air. A heavy-weight plane means more resistance. Combining all three, the aircraft would have to struggle. But the good part was that both pilots have taken off from Tamanrasset many times before. They knew the conditions and were familiar with the Sahara's challenges. So the tower cleared them for takeoff on runway 02. Captain Benawicha delegated the takeoff to First Officer Yousfi. She'd be the pilot flying for this leg. Yousfi pushed the throttles forward, the engines roared up to takeoff power. The plane started rolling down the runway, picking up speed. Benawicha monitored the airspeed. Gradually, the runway blurred beneath them as the plane accelerated. And then they crossed V12, the threshold points after which there's no turning back. The nose tilted upward, the main gear left the ground, and then finally the flight was airborne. Once it took off, Yousfi asked the captain to gear up. But before Benawicha could touch the landing gear lever, everything went wrong. A series of thundering bangs erupted from the left engine. Inside that engine, the fatigue cracks in the Stage 1 nozzle guide vane had finally reached critical point. A large section of the blade broke away, and it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. First, the high-pressure turbine disintegrated, followed by the low-pressure turbine. Bits of turbine blades sprayed out onto the runway behind them like shrapnel. The left engine lost its power instantly. And right then, the plane's nose skidded hard to the left. This happened because of basic physics. When one engine quits and the other keeps pushing, you get an asymmetric thrust condition. As a result, the plane wants to spin toward the dead engine. In this flight, the left engine was gone, so the nose swung left, and this is where training and preparation matter the most. And Yousfi needed to initiate the engine failure on the takeoff procedure immediately. The steps were simple. Set the nose angle, maintain V2 speed, get the gear up, increase thrust on the right engine, and use rudder to counter the side-by-side nose movements. But before she could do any of these things, or before either pilot had even identified which engine failed, Captain Benawicha made a sudden decision that would doom them all. He took control of the airplane right away in the middle of the emergency. While he should have been scanning his instruments to diagnose the problem, which was his job as pilot, not flying, he demanded a control handover. This was clearly the worst decision he could make. Think about what's happening here. Yousfi was hand-flying the plane, so she had the stick in her hands and she could feel what the aircraft was doing. Her role is clearly defined. She was the pilot flying. And the captain's role was also clearly defined. He's pilot monitoring. So he should be looking at the engine gauges and announcing the left engine failure. That would help Yousfi to carry out the procedures she had memorized. Instead, he created chaos and confusion in the cockpit. Yousfi even asked, "Gear up," but Benawicha didn't reply. And after taking control, he was flying it all wrong. He held the nose up by 18 degrees, which was normal for a two-engine climb. But with one engine dead, he needed to keep the nose angle below 12 degrees. Otherwise, the plane would simply drain energy, because the single remaining engine simply cannot push them up that steep. But since he did that, their speed started dropping, fast. And then something bizarre happened. The right engine started losing power too. Not because anything is wrong with it, but someone in the cockpit was pulling back the throttle. Either the captain was doing it accidentally while trying to control the plane, or there's confusion about who's flying. We could never know for sure. Meanwhile, the plane climbed toward 400 feet, struggling. Every second that passed brought them closer to a stall. Finally, First Officer Yousfi keyed her microphone and reported, "We have a small problem, 6230. Yes, she misreads their flight number out of stress. Meanwhile, Captain Benawicha apparently thought she was still trying to fly the plane. He commanded, "Let go, remove your hand," and Yousfi insisted, "I've let go, I've let go." This chaotic back and forth happened twice, and it was insane. They were arguing about who had control while the plane was dying in the air. And neither pilot was monitoring the airspeed or looking at the engine instruments. Even worse, none of them had identified the failed engine. They hadn't discussed shutting it down or increased thrust on the good engine. Plus, the landing gear was also not retracted, which was creating massive drag. Naturally, the airspeed continued to decay. The nose angle stayed steep at 18 degrees, and the plane was running out of energy. And finally, the inevitable happened. The stick shaker activated. It's a hard-to-ignore shaking of the control column that warns pilots of an imminent stall. It means you have seconds before the wings stop producing lift. And the plane was about to fall out of the sky. Now, a stall at high altitude is survivable. You make the nose angle down, trade altitude for speed, letting the airflow reattach to the wings. But this flight wasn't at altitude. They were only 400 feet above the desert. From that height, if you stall, you have maybe 3 or 4 seconds before impact. There's no room for recovery. And the horror got real. The plane suddenly stopped climbing and Flight 6289 stalled. Immediately, the ground proximity warning system called out,
"Don't sink, don't sink, don't sink."
But even in the life and death moment, the captain kept saying, "Remove your hand."
Don't sink.
And they were about to enter a free fall. At 335 feet above the ground, both black boxes suddenly lost power. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder stopped recording. But it was bizarre. Because on the 737, if both engines quit producing electrical power and the auxiliary power unit was also not running, only then the black boxes went dark. So did one of the pilots accidentally shut down both engines? We'll never know what the pilot said in those final seconds. But the plane was already stalled and the free fall started, which was beyond anyone's control.
Don't sink. Don't sink.
Within seconds, Flight 6289 slammed into the Sahara Desert, just past the end of runway 02. The impact was relatively low speed because they'd lost so much energy, but the plane was full of fuel. The moment they hit the ground, the fuel tanks ruptured and fire erupted instantly. The plane slid across the Trans-Saharan Highway. The fuselage stayed mostly intact. The cockpit and the tail broke away. The wings separated entirely, but the center section, where most passengers sit, held together. But it didn't save anyone because the fire was too intense. Flames consumed the entire aircraft within seconds. Anyone who might have survived the impact was killed by the inferno and unbearable heat. Controllers saw the crash from the tower. They hit the emergency alarm. Firefighters raced toward the scene. Still, it took 3.5 minutes to reach the wreckage. When they arrived, the plane was already a burning shell with everything gone. But then they found something impossible. 50 meters back from the wreckage, lying in the sand, was a man. He was not in the plane, badly injured, barely conscious, but he was alive. The firefighters rushed to him. He was the 28-year-old Algerian soldier seated in the back row. When the tail section broke away on impact, he was thrown clear. While 102 people burned to death inside the fuselage, he was ejected into the sand. Ambulances rushed him to the hospital as he had multiple injuries, severe trauma. The doctors weren't sure he'd make it. But within hours, his condition stabilized. His survival was beyond lucky, as no one survived Algeria's worst air disaster at the time, except him. But what really happened that led to such a disaster? How did a routine domestic flight turn into a catastrophe? The investigation began urgently. Algeria didn't have a dedicated aircraft accident investigation agency. Instead, the Ministry of Transport established a special commission of inquiry. The transport minister himself led it. They examined the wreckage, recovered the black boxes, and analyzed the data. The engine failure was easy to identify. The left engine's stage 1 nozzle guide vane failed due to fatigue cracks, as we already said earlier, due to thermal damage and aging. The blade broke apart, destroying the turbines downstream, and the engine couldn't produce power. But there was something else which looked disturbing. When investigators examined the right engine, they found similar cracks in its nozzle guide vanes. And they raised serious questions about Air Algérie's maintenance practices. How were they inspecting these engines? What's their overhaul schedule? Were they cutting corners? The Commission of Inquiry didn't dig into this, they just noted the findings and moved on. But no investigation into maintenance practices happened. But the engine failure alone shouldn't have caused a crash. This aircraft was certified to climb even on one engine, even at maximum takeoff weight. Airlines proved this during certification flights, and indeed, it was not easy, especially in the conditions at Tamanrasset, where they had high altitude, hot temperature, heavy weight, extended landing gear. The performance margins were slim, but absolutely doable. A well-trained crew should have handled this easily. So why didn't they? The cockpit voice recorder revealed the story. Captain Benoitcha's immediate instinct was to take control from First Officer Yousfi. No one knows why. The Commission of Inquiry suggests he might have seen Yousfi struggling, or he might have felt it was his duty as captain to take over during an emergency. But there's another possibility they didn't explore. Maybe he didn't trust her at all. His very first priority when something went wrong wasn't to diagnose the problem. It was to make sure Yousfi wasn't flying the plane. And that only made sense if he believed she was incapable. Was there evidence for this? Look at the facts. Yousfi actually had more hours in flying 737 than Benoitcha. Also, she had done nothing wrong up to this point. She was clearly following procedures. But it was Benoitcha who broke protocol by chatting with the flight attendant during the briefing. This is no news that Algeria was a highly patriarchal society. And in the backdrop, Yousfi was the first woman to ever fly for an Algerian airline. Maybe Benoitcha couldn't trust first officers on principle. Maybe he specially didn't trust a female first officer. We can't know for sure. But the way he frantically kept saying, "Remove your hands," to her, it suggested he saw her as the immediate threat, not the failed engine. After he took control, the confusion increased. He kept telling her to let go even though she kept insisting she already had. This means either he was not looking at what she was doing, or he didn't believe her. Meanwhile, he was holding the nose angle constantly at 18 degrees, which was way too steep for a single-engine climb. Even worse, he never responded to her suggestions about retracting the landing gear. Clearly, he was not following procedures, and neither pilot ever mentioned the engines. There's no discussion of shutting down the failed engine. It's possible they never figured out what was wrong. Maybe because the botched control handover created confusion about roles. Who's supposed to monitor the instruments? Benoitcha might think it's Yousfi's job as pilot, not flying. But Yousfi might think Benoitcha already knew, because he took control so quickly. If nobody looked at the engine gauges, they might never identify the problem. There's another possibility too. Maybe they knew an engine failed, but they shut down the wrong one. This has happened before in aviation history. Pilots experience an engine failure, make a snap judgment about which engine is dead, and reduce power to the wrong engine. It's rare, but it happens when crews don't take time to verify their instruments. This could explain why the right engine lost power after the left one failed. But did one of the pilots really kill both engines? The Commission of Inquiry never investigated this possibility. So the problem was the evidence. The flight data recorder on this aircraft was ancient. It only tracked 6 parameters. Basic stuff: airspeed, altitude, heading, acceleration. It didn't record control column forces, throttle position, or individual engine parameters in detail. Without that detailed data, proving whether the pilots misidentified the failed engine was nearly impossible. The Commission had to work with what they had, which wasn't much. But the frustrating thing was that they didn't even try. They only noted the engine failure, issued some routine recommendations, and moved on. They never investigated why Captain Benawicha immediately demanded control instead of diagnosing the problem first, or why the pre-flight briefing was interrupted and never completed. These questions never get answered. The Commission of Inquiry issued 4 recommendations. First, Air Algérie should provide better training on control handovers. Second, all Algerian flight crews should undergo a one-time assessment of their procedural compliance. Third, Air Algérie should implement a safety analysis program using anonymous reports and flight data to identify unsafe trends. Fourth, and most critical, the Ministry of Transport should create an independent accident investigation agency. These recommendations were good, but not enough. So the brutal truth is, 102 people died because of 8 seconds of confusion in the cockpit. 8 seconds between engine failure and stall, and that's all the time they had, which they wasted arguing about who was flying the plane. The engine failure was survivable. Airlines deal with engine failures regularly. Pilots train for this scenario constantly in simulators. The Boeing 737 could fly on one engine, but the procedures must be followed. And in this flight, they never briefed on the procedure, so they never had a backup plan. Captain Benawicha and First Officer Yousfi walked into that cockpit unprepared, and when disaster struck, they had nothing to fall back on. This is why the pre-flight briefing matters. The sterile cockpit rule exists, and good communication with clearly defined roles is needed. Otherwise, everyone might die. In the cockpit, Captain Benawicha and First Officer Yousfi died, still confused about what was happening. The last words on the cockpit voice recorder are Benawicha telling Yousfi to remove her hand from the controls. Even as the ground rushed up, even as the GPWS screamed warnings, even as the plane stalled and fell, he was still fixated on the completely wrong problem. That's the tragedy. But the crash of Flight 6289 never pushed Algeria toward real reform. Air Algérie didn't upgrade its training, maintenance, or investigation systems. Naturally, then came more disasters. In 2014, an MD-83 flying for Air Algérie crashed in Mali, killing 116. In 2018, a military transport plane crashed in Boufarik, killing 257. These losses show the same problems continued. The inquiry had advised creating an independent investigation agency, but it never happened. And without proper investigations, systemic issues stay hidden. But every time the passengers trusted the airline and the system built to keep them safe, and the system never took that trust seriously. So let me ask you this. If an airline never fixes the deeper problems, can passengers ever call it safe? And when a cockpit freezes in those crucial seconds, is it really the engine that fails, or the system behind the pilots? Until we meet again, fly safe.